Some childhoods do not break loudly. They fade, not in memory perhaps, but in feeling. In the quiet way a child stops reaching, in the way they learn to read a room before they learn to read themselves. An unloved childhood is not always a house full of obvious cruelty. Sometimes it's a house where nothing terrible seems to happen, and yet something essential never arrives. Warmth, safety, being known. So the child adapts. They become pleasing, useful, invisible, strong too early. They learn that love may be conditional, that tenderness may be absent, that their deepest needs might only echo back as silence. And years later, even when life appears full, some part of them still waits in that first emotional winter, trying to understand why being alive once felt like asking for too much. The first quiet ache. There is a particular kind of sorrow that rarely announces itself. It does not always come with dramatic memories, no shattered glass, no obvious catastrophe. Sometimes it comes as a feeling with no name, a heaviness in ordinary moments, a strange distance from joy, the sense that everyone else received an emotional map for life, and somehow yours was left blank. This is often how an unloved childhood survives into adulthood, not as a clear story, but as a climate. A person may not say, "Something terrible happened to me." They may simply say, "I don't know why I feel this empty," or "I don't know why love makes me anxious," or "I don't know why I always feel like a burden." Because the first wound was not always impact. Sometimes it was a mission, not being comforted when fear became too big, not being mirrored when joy appeared, not being held in a way that made emotions feel safe to have. A child cannot interpret absence as limitation in the adults around them. A child almost always interprets absence as truth about themselves. So the ache becomes private. They laugh at the right moments. They function. They achieve. They become the easy child, the mature child, the child who asks for little and gives much. But underneath that adaptation lives a small and unspoken confusion. If love did not arrive when it was needed most, what does that say about me? This is why the effects of emotional neglect can be so difficult to identify. They do not always look like pain. Sometimes they look like competence, hyper-independence, emotional self-containment, a chronic inability to lean, an instinct to apologize for existing. Their research on neglect describes long-term difficulties with emotion regulation, self-esteem, social connection, and coping. Injuries that often remain hidden precisely because they formed so early and so quietly. And so adulthood begins with an old ache wearing new clothes. A person may crave intimacy and fear it in the same breath. They may long to be understood, then hide the moment someone gets close. They may feel lonely in crowded rooms, guilty when cared for, uneasy when rested, suspicious of tenderness that asks for nothing in return. None of this is random. It is what silence sounds like when it has lived inside a person for years. Where love went missing. Most unloved children do not grow up asking, "Why were they unable to love me?" They ask something far more painful. "What was wrong with me?" This is the tragedy of early emotional deprivation. The child stands at the center of a world they did not build, yet takes responsibility for its weather. If a parent is cold, the child believes they are unworthy of warmth. If a caregiver is unpredictable, the child assumes they must become more pleasing, more useful, less difficult. The developing mind does not naturally conclude, "The adults around me were limited." It concludes, "I must be the problem." But love often goes missing for reasons the child could never understand. Sometimes caregivers were carrying their own unhealed histories. Sometimes they were depressed, dissociated, frightened, emotionally immature, or shaped by cultures that treated tenderness as weakness. Sometimes they provided food, school, clothing, and routine, yet could not offer the softer nourishment of attunement, eye contact that lingers, curiosity about feelings, comfort that does not shame, presence that does not disappear when emotion enters the room. In attachment theory, the earliest bond teaches a child what closeness means. When care is sensitive and responsive, distress can be expressed and soothed. When care is insensitive, frightening, or inconsistent, the child may stop using the caregiver as a safe haven. Those patterns do not vanish with age. They often continue in altered form into adult emotional life and relationships. This does not mean every emotionally unavailable parent intended harm. Intention and impact are not the same thing. A home can appear functional and still leave a child emotionally starving. There may be birthdays, homework help, family dinners, and still no real sense of being known. A child can be materially supported while inwardly abandoned, and because nothing visible seems missing, the grief becomes harder to trust. Yet the body notices. The nervous system notices. It notices when affection must be earned, when sadness is inconvenient, when fear is mocked, when anger is dangerous, when a child must care for the adults instead of being cared for by them. Over time, the child's personality begins to organize itself around survival inside that environment. The origins of the wound, then, are not always found in a single event. They are found in repetition. 1,000 moments of misattunement, 1,000 silences, 1,000 emotional doorways closing just as the child begins to knock. And eventually, to survive the unanswered knocking, the child learns not to knock at all. What the mind learns. When emotional neglect happens early enough, it does not feel like an experience. It feels like reality. The child does not think, "I am adapting to deprivation." The child simply becomes the adaptation. This is one of the deepest psychological effects of an unloved childhood. Survival patterns harden into identity. What was once protection begins to feel like personality. Science has given language to this process. Adverse childhood experiences, including neglect, can create prolonged stress states, sometimes described as toxic stress. The longer a child lives in emotional uncertainty, the more deeply stress response systems may be shaped by it. The effects can reach brain development, immune function, attention, decision-making, learning, and later mental health. Children exposed to these conditions may also have more difficulty forming stable relationships as adults. This helps explain why the unloved child often grows into an adult who is always bracing, not necessarily for danger in the obvious sense, but for rupture, rejection, withdrawal, shame. They scan faces, they monitor tone, they prepare for disappointment before it arrives. The nervous system becomes fluent in anticipation. Calm, meanwhile, can feel unfamiliar, sometimes even suspicious. Emotion regulation is often changed by this history as well. If a child's feelings were ignored or punished, they may not learn how to identify, tolerate, or express those feelings safely. Later, emotions may come out sideways, through numbness, irritability, overachievement, dissociation, panic, or a relentless need to stay busy so nothing tender has time to rise to the surface. Studies on neglect describe lasting problems with coping, self-esteem, executive function, anxiety, and socio-emotional development. And then there is the self-concept. Perhaps no injury cuts deeper than the silent conclusion an unloved child draws, that being unseen must mean being insignificant. This belief may never be spoken aloud, but it influences everything. Which love feels believable, which boundaries feel allowed, which dreams feel deserved, whether rest feels safe, whether failure feels survivable. Neglect has also been linked to a higher risk of depression later in life. Research cited by the National Institute of Mental Health found that childhood abuse or neglect increased the risk of major depression. Is with neglect notably associated with current depression in adulthood. So the mind learns what the environment teaches it. If love was inconsistent, the mind learns uncertainty. If care was absent, the mind learns self-erasure. If tenderness was scarce, the body learns not to expect rescue. These are not flaws. They are lessons learned in the oldest classroom of all, the need to belong. The war inside. The unloved child does not disappear. They become divided. One part still longs with extraordinary innocence. It wants closeness, safety, tenderness without performance. It wants to rest inside another person's presence and not feel afraid. It wants the ancient hunger to end. But another part has studied the cost of needing. That part remembers, even without words. It remembers what it was like to reach and receive nothing. To cry and feel alone inside the crying. To need comfort and feel shame instead. So it grows vigilant, protective, skeptical. It says, do not depend, do not reveal too much, do not want too openly. Wanting is where the pain began. This is the inner war that often follows an unloved childhood. They move toward love and away from it at the same time. They may chase unavailable people because distance feels familiar, or push away healthy intimacy because steadiness feels unreal. They may appear independent, even powerful, while privately aching for someone to notice how tired they are. They may give endless understanding to others and feel almost allergic to receiving the same. Sometimes the conflict becomes perfectionism. If love once felt conditional, then flawlessness can start to look like safety. The person becomes careful, excellent, or useful beyond reason. Every mistake feels larger than it is, because beneath the surface, mistakes are never just mistakes. They carry an old terror. If imperfection is seen, abandonment may follow. Sometimes the conflict becomes people-pleasing. The self bends, adapts, translates itself into whatever keeps closeness intact. Needs are delayed, preferences disappear, boundaries feel guilty, and resentment, when it finally arrives, feels confusing because the person has been rewarded all their life for self-erasure. Sometimes the conflict becomes numbness, not because the heart is cold, but because it learned long ago that feeling too much with nowhere safe to put it becomes unbearable. So the psyche does what it can. It blunts the edges, it disconnects, it survives through distance. The World Health Organization notes that child maltreatment, including neglect, can have severe long-term mental health consequences such as anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, and effects on cognition and academic functioning. Extreme stress in childhood can disrupt early brain development and later contribute to behavioral, physical, and emotional difficulties, and so the war continues in silence. A person may seem calm, successful, accommodating. Yet inside, an older argument is still unfolding. Can love be trusted? Can I be known and remain safe? If I stop performing, will anyone stay? These are not dramatic questions. They are the afterlife of emotional hunger. The moment of seeing. There is a moment, quiet and life-altering, when the story begins to change. Not because the past changes, it does not, but because the meaning of the past begins to loosen. For years, maybe decades, the unloved child in adult form has carried one central accusation. Something in me made love difficult. Something in me caused the distance. Something in me was too much, or not enough, or never quite right. This belief may sit so deep that it does not even feel like a belief. It feels like fact. Then one day, sometimes through a sentence, a relationship, a collapse, a memory, or a season of unbearable exhaustion, another possibility appears. What if the emptiness was not proof of defect? What if it was evidence of deprivation? This realization can be profoundly destabilizing. Because to recognize emotional neglect is not only to understand, it is also to grieve. It means seeing that the ache had a source, that the loneliness was not invented, that the child truly did need more than was given, and grief arrives in layers. Grief for what happened, grief for what never happened, grief for the child who kept trying, grief for the adult who spent years turning injury into identity. Yet within that grief, something merciful begins. Shame starts to lose its authority. The person begins to see that their guardedness was not madness, but adaptation. Their overthinking was vigilance, their self-erasure was strategy, their numbness was shelter. The nervous system, the heart, the mind, none of them were trying to ruin a life. They were trying to survive one. This reframing matters deeply. Psychological literature has increasingly emphasized that emotional abuse and neglect can be as harmful as, and at times more harmful than, other forms of maltreatment in their impact on mental health and development. The recognition is not dramatic. It is tender. A person looks back and realizes, the child was not difficult. The child was alone. The child was not too sensitive. The child was underheld. The child was not failing at love. The child was trying to find it in a place where it could not fully grow. And from that point on, the inner voice begins, very slowly, to change. Not all at once, not permanently, but enough. Enough for blame to soften into context. Enough for confusion to become language. Enough for a life once organized around self-doubt to begin making room for truth. The turning point is not becoming someone new. It is finally seeing who had been carrying the pain all along. Learning a kinder-language healing rarely arrives as a grand event. It comes more like weather changing, a subtle softening in places that were once permanently winter, a new response where an old reflex used to live, a moment of rest without guilt, a tear that is no longer embarrassing, a boundary that does not feel like cruelty. a silence that no longer feels like abandonment. For someone shaped by an unloved childhood, healing is often less about becoming fearless and more about becoming less divided, less at war with need, less ashamed of tenderness, less convinced that survival must always require self-betrayal. This is not simple work, because the old patterns were built for a reason. Hyper-independence once protected dignity, numbness once protected overwhelm, pleasing once protected connection, even mistrust had wisdom inside it. It kept the heart from expecting warmth in cold places. So healing does not insult these defenses. It understands them. It thanks them quietly for how long they kept watch. Then, slowly, another language begins to form. A language in which feelings are signals, not threats. In which closeness is not automatically fused with danger. In which the body is allowed to exhale before it has earned rest. In which the self is not treated as a problem to manage, but as a life to accompany. Research on attachment and development suggests that early relationships shape later emotional patterns, but it also shows that supportive, sensitive care matters profoundly, and that healthier relational experiences can alter trajectories. Attachment theory emphasizes both the impact of early bonds and the value of responsive connection in promoting well-being. Public health research echoes this hope in quieter language. The CDC notes that the effects of adverse childhood experiences can be reduced through protective factors and supportive environments. The WHO similarly emphasizes that early recognition, ongoing care, and nurturing relationships can lessen the consequences of maltreatment. But healing is not a straight line toward light. Some days the old ache returns with full authority. Some moments of love still feel unbearable to receive. Some losses can never be repaired in the exact form they were needed. This too belongs to integration, the understanding that healing does not erase history. It changes the relationship to it. The person begins to live with more room inside, room for grief without drowning, room for tenderness without suspicion, room for the child they were and the adult they are becoming, not untouched, not finished, but gentler. And sometimes gentleness is the first real proof that the unloved child has finally met a different kind of home, the child still inside. In the end, an unloved childhood is not only a story about absence, it is also a story about what survived the absence. Because something did survive. Beneath the adaptations, beneath the guarded smile, the overthinking, the distance, the shame, the relentless competence, the fear of burdening others, something small and faithful remained. Not untouched, but unextinguished. A child heart that kept waiting for a world that felt warm enough to enter. That child is not gone. They appear in strange moments, in the sadness that arrives after kindness, in the panic that follows vulnerability. In the longing that has no obvious object. In the way certain songs, certain silences, certain disappointments feel older than the present moment. The child is still there, not asking for perfection, only recognition. And perhaps this is one of the deepest truths. What was unloved does not become unlovable. It may become hidden. It may become defended. It may become difficult to reach. But difficulty is not the same as lack of worth. The child who learned to be quiet was still worthy of being heard. The child who learned not to need was still worthy of comfort. The child who became strong too early was still worthy of being carried. There is sorrow in this recognition, yes. But there is also dignity. Because to understand the effects of an unloved childhood is to understand the brilliance of survival. The psyche did not collapse without reason. It organized itself around the only forms of safety it could find. And though those forms may later feel lonely, they were once acts of intelligence performed by a heart with very few choices. So the story closes not with triumph, but with tenderness. A person may never recover the exact childhood that was missing. Some doors closed too early. Some needs were unanswered in the years they mattered most. That grief deserves its own holy silence. And still, life continues, not as a denial of what was lost, but as a place where meaning can deepen. The child inside no longer has to remain nameless, no longer has to carry the blame, no longer has to confuse absence with unworthiness. There is something quietly healing in that. To look back and say, you were never too much, you were never the problem. You were a child standing in the cold, doing your best to call it home, and perhaps the most human ending is this. Even after an unloved beginning, the heart does not stop hoping. It only learns to hope more carefully, more slowly, more truthfully. Until one day, somewhere deep within, the child who waited so long is no longer waiting to be proven worthy of love, only waiting to be met.